So now I want to talk about other input types. So far we've been talking about text input and sort of the post and how to handle the post. And now there's other form tags. Now this is probably not the best example of this. There's some amazing good examples of form types. And so I just kind of want to show you here more how these different form types, different input types interact with post data. And so text, we have that one already, password, radio button, and how they all, these different things, how you put the information into HTML and how you get the information back out of the post arrays inside of PHP. So this isn't the best description of all these input types. It is really just how these input types affect PHP. Okay, so we start with the three types of text fields, right? And so we have a input type text. So we have the variations on text fields. And so here is a couple things. We have input type text. This is the kind of thing we've been playing around with all the time. And then we have the name equals. And remember, ID equals is only for CSS. And then this name equals account corresponds to the data that ends up in the post array. So if we type Beth, then this Beth that we've typed ends up in the $_post array under the key account. And if we have a second text field named Nick, well, then that creates another element in the $post array, BK for example. And then the password type is just like a text type, except that it's not shown on the screen, but it is definitely transmitted to the server as not hidden. You want to have HTTPS to encode your sessions if you want to protect this stuff. And then inside the PHP, the PW field turns into, a text field looks just like a PW field for whatever text was typed in for the password on this field. That's what you see in PHP. So you get these names, you get all these names, name, 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 and then that corresponds exactly to the keys in the $post array. So you do have to make these names unique at least for within a particular form. Now you can have multiple forms on a page, and then each form, every one you submit, that's the keys you don't. You don't get the forms for you don't get the keys for the other forms on a page. So another type of user input area is a radio button, and the key to radio buttons is that you put as many as you want on. You just basically say input type radio, and you'll notice the text just sort of shows up afterwards. Input type radio, and the key thing to do is you end up with input fields with the exact same name. And that's how you connect the behavior that only one can be turned on at a time. So here we have our little form, and you got your account, got your password, that's the same thing hidden. But we're talking now about the radio buttons, and the idea of the radio buttons is only one can be turned on at a time. You could have 4 of them, and only one can be turned on at the same time. And the key trick here is that the name being the same, you could have as many of these radio buttons as you like, and as long as the name is the same, only one of them would be turned on at the same. And they don't have to be next to each other in the file. They could be far, far apart, as long as they're in the same form and they have the same name. And then there is the value, and this value, you change it for each of your radio buttons if that's what you want, because whichever one is checked, in this case this one is checked, that value comes in. So even though there's many of these on the form, only one of them is going to be sent to you. So when is set to PM because we checked PM, and we hit the form submission. Now if we look at checkboxes, you'll notice that checkboxes can be all checked. You can check them all if you want. And the key we do in checkboxes is we use different names. It's because you might have class 1 checked, or you might have class 3 checked, or you might have both of them checked. And so if you had both of them checked, you would get a class 3 string and a class 1 string. And you get values, right? Sometimes the presence of it is important, and sometimes you put the value in. And if you want, you can pre-indicate, like I have here, that one of these checkboxes is to be pre-checked in your output HTML that you're generating. So if you want to do a drop-down, this is a select box. So you say select, and you have name on the select item, and that is going to determine the name in the post data. Okay, and then you have a series of options, and the options are simply the text, and you have 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That tells you which of these was selected. And right now it's the first one is going to be selected. So if you just hit enter, you're going to see 0, right? But if you change it and then you change it to Pepsi, you will see non-zero. So let's take a quick look at that one. So here we go. Let me hit refresh to start myself out with a fresh thing. And so if I just come down and hit submit, this soda is value 0, and so soda ends up with 0. But if I change to Pepsi and then I hit submit, you will see that that turns the value of soda to 2, because that was the value that was associated with the Pepsi dropdown. And if you want, you can indicate something other than the first one. By default, the first one will be selected, but if you put selected on one of these options, then that indicates that that one is selected. And this also shows the notion that these values do not have to be numbers, although a lot of folks do tend to use numbers, but they can just as easily be strings. And so this is chips, peanuts, or cookies, and so in this case the name snack turns into the key in the post array, and the peanuts selected. In this case I didn't change it. You can still change it. You could even change it back to please select, and then this sort of shows one other thing that you could send value of blank, but there would still be snack here, and you could check to see if it was is set, right? Use is set to check to see if snack existed, even if it was a blank. So and so that's what would go on here, and that might be like, you might put up an error message, say, look, I wanted you to select one. But in this case, we're really talking about adding the string selected to force a pre-selected item, other than in the previous example we just used the first item as pre-selected. So a very valuable thing, and we use this all the time for large blocks of text, mostly sort of paragraph type of thing, is the text area. So text area is a little bit different format. You say text area and / text area, and the default content is in between them. Okay, and it has a name, and that name turns into the post data that you get, and you get sort of new lines and all kinds of stuff in there. You get pretty much exactly what was typed, and you can control the size of the text area. And there's ways in JavaScript, which we'll talk about later, to add super kind of toolbars to make bold and italics and stuff like that. But hey, that's beyond this particular class. A multiple select. Not a lot of people like using multiple selects, but we include them here. And so it's basically a select statement, just like the option and all that other stuff, with values and strings. That the strings determine what shows up, and the values determine what we send in here. So these values kind of going to come in there at the post data. The weird thing is add multiple equals multiple, which means right away it's displayed differently in most browsers. I scribbled on top of that. Multiple equals multiple. It's displayed differently in different browsers. And you say, I would like to send this in as an array, because it's not just code, it's code that's going to be an array. And so this is a situation where we have an array in our post data, which is all the keys, but then if we look at the code, it maps to another array that has values 0 and 1, which means that this and this one and this one were selected, and we press submit. And you can do this, and you'll figure this out, and probably you'll spend a little time debugging by just print R-ing your post array, which is exactly what I'm doing here. I have to figure it out kind of every time I start. Every time I start over, it's like, how do multiple selects work? Why do I even want to do that? Now there's another, so now we're down at the bottom, and we have to submit this form. And you don't have to, but you can put a name on a submit and then a value. And the submit is kind of annoying because this value, if you were going to support multiple languages like English and Spanish, you would want that to be changing. But that value, just like all input tags, comes in as data. And so most programmers do not actually use the text, right? They use different names. And so if they're put multiple submit buttons on, they will change the names of the submit button and do an is set on the key rather than check to see if the string is submit, but use value. But the problem is you have to put value on here. I'm probably making a bigger deal about this than I should, but you have to put value on there to get that text to show up. And then that text is submitted, which seems completely logical except when you want to translate that text. You don't want to be putting if statements in your PHP code that are looking for translated stuff. You don't want to have, if the English, look for submit, if Spanish, look for whatever Spanish for submit would be. And so that's the first thing, is most people just, like I say, check for the is set of the key and then give buttons different names. If you're going to have a bunch of buttons across here, give them all different names and check for the key existence. Use this as just a user interface bit. Okay, enough on that. Now, one of the things that we often want to do is like a cancel button or an escape button that is not exactly a form post. It really should be like a link, href, to go somewhere else. But then, unless you have fancy CSS skills, an href looks very different. And so it's possible to teach a button to function like an href. And so this little pattern that I'm showing right here is a good example of this. So I have input type equals button, okay, and I'm using the onClick. This is onClick data, which says when I click on escape, run this JavaScript. So this is actually JavaScript, 2 lines of JavaScript, 1 semicolon, semicolon. And location.href is talking to the document object model and saying this is change the location bar to be this. So we're going to a new website, and then return false basically says do not submit the form. So you don't want to both navigate the browser away at the same time that you're submitting the form to the old page. And so that's why we return this false. And so this is a pattern. You don't have to fully understand this right now, but it is a way to basically create a button that that looks like a button but functions like an anchor tag or with an href. Another thing that you can play with is HTML5 input types. And so these are a series of input types that are quite nice. Some of them, like dates, etc., are great. Not all browsers support all input types. There are some JavaScript libraries that sort of emulate some of these things in older browsers. But the thing is you can actually start using these somewhat with impunity because all the browsers treat an input type that they don't understand as if it were type equals text. So if you said input type equals Fred, that'd be like a text box. It'd be like, I don't know what to do, so I'm going to put this up as a text box. It's always been that way long, long, long ago. It wasn't like the browsers blew up when they didn't recognize the input type. They just treated it as input type text. So that's pretty cool. Now, there's various pages and websites that can tell you what browsers have what support, but that's a moving target, and it's going to get better over time to support these things. And so there's no point in writing down which browser does which thing. But here's sort of just a real quick page that shows all these things. So we have a color picker, which could be rendered roughly like that. Now you'll see that different browsers will render these things in different ways. And they have names, and the value here is the default would be a default hex color, and that's # red, green, and blue. And so this is like blue to the max, green to the min, and red to the min. And that's why my default color there is blue. You can make a date picker. Wonderful. Again, if you think about this, this falls back to a text field and sends you text in a format like that, which is a ISO 6 something something date format. But you get this cool user interface. We'll play this in a second. An email format is really like a text field, except it's validated, which means you can't put non-email format in. Now the key thing is that validation only happens when you press submit. So you can type it, you type it wrong, it's not popping up while you're typing. You hit the submit, and your browser generally refuses to submit it if it's got invalid data. The same is similar for numbers. You can type them, but you can also hit, in some browsers, you can hit these up and down. We'll play with that. You can tell it the minimum and maximum numbers you're willing to take, and input validation happens when you press submit. You can ask for URL validation, and you can, this is just input type equals flying. That just is to show that when in doubt, you can have any input type you want, and it's treated like a text field in the browser. So let's take a look at, play with this one a bit. Let's switch to HTML5. Okay, so here we have some things. This is a quick link. I don't know if this link will go forever, but here's a color picker, and you can pick a color and use your operating system built-in color picker. You can pick a date picker, and this is all different for different browsers. I'm using Chrome at this point, and so this is how Chrome renders this stuff. So if I have an email called bad, and then I can have a quantity between 1 and 5, and I'll put like 9, so I got 99. It let me put it in, right? Add your home page. I'm gonna do all kinds of bad stuff here. That. And remember, this is the flying saucer one. So at this point, I haven't I haven't hit submit yet. So all these bad ones are not yet validated. But I'm going to hit submit now, and it's not actually going to send the data to the server, right? So it suppressed the submit. It stopped the submit action and said, I'm not happy. So I'll go bad@bad.com. And now if I hit submit, that's going to be good, but it is going to come down and complain about this one. And so again, the server is absolutely not, you see this post array is not changing, right? So the server is absolutely not involved in what I'm doing right now. So I'll just, I'll make this be 3, so I'll behave there. Notice that you can change, but that's again a browser. And if I hit submit, it's like that. This one is good, this one is good, but now, and again, nothing's going on at the server at this point. It's all browser stopping the submit. So if I go HTTP, go on www.drchuck.com, and now I hit the submit, and it's going to do all of its validation, and finally all this data is going to pass to the server. So the server, I've been hitting submit, and absolutely nothing is happening in the server at this point. But now I hit submit, boom, now it's made a request response round trip. And you'll notice that everything's been reset as well, because I didn't put any code in my HTML to grab the old values, but I have dumped all of the new values. And so I get a color, and remember my color was yellow, which is a bit of green and a red, green, and blue. It's a bit of yellow is a lot of red and a bit of green, I guess. Okay, so almost, and then my birthday field comes in this sort of like year, month, day. The email comes in just as a string field. This comes in as a string field. Homepage comes in as a string field, and saucer comes in. I forgot to type something there. Well, if I type something, it would come in. So the fact that I have a input type that's junk, it don't matter. It just is a text field, which means all of these things would be text fields if HTML5 was not supported in my particular browser. Okay? So that's HTML5. And like I said, use these. Don't hesitate to use them right now, because you may have to give your user a little bit of extra instruction about if it's not HTML5 and you're asking for a date, you should tell them to put the date in using that format, right? But there's no reason not to. You could say, enter the date in this format, blah 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 blah, because or use the date picker. So that's a little bit tricky. So you got to realize that if it's falling back, this would just be a text box. It would look just like this, and it would be totally blank. But if you put in a default value in there, that's not bad, and so they would at least see that default value. Okay? So that's our quick run through forms in this chapter, how the $get and $post array pulled all this data in using HTML entities to sanitize HTML to not create the basically most shameful mistake that you can make in PHP and most common mistake. The model view controller pattern, that's where we did the post data at the first part, and that was silent code. And then there's this line, and then out comes the HTML. This would be kind of like in a model view controller, this we call this part kind of the model part, which is dealing with the data, and this would be the view. Talked about different kinds of form fields, kind of ran through them. Like I said, there's so much better data somewhere else on the internet. This is not a lecture to figure out how to do magic HTML. And then we talked about new form fields in HTML5. So thanks for listening, and we'll see you in the next lecture.